Okay, so now we are moving along in Steiner's outline of esoteric science here. We're about at the halfway point. We're at the section called Old Moon, or the Moon phase, which, as we have seen, we've gone through the Saturn phase, in which the physical body was constructed for humans, the Sun phase in which the etheric body was constructed for humans, and now this is the Moon phase in which the astral body will be constructed. Each phase gets more complicated, and as you're reading it, difficult to understand and remember because there's so many details in Steiner. It's so dense. I've had to go over it a few times, and there's a lot of details. There's a lot going on in the Moon phase. We're going to have the separation of not the moon. This isn't our moon that he's talking about. This is not the physical moon. This is just, he calls it old moon, that separates from the sun, just as we saw last time, where new Saturn separated from the sun and revolved around it. So we're going to see a separation here. And a number, we'll notice as we go through this, that a number of processes have not yet sufficiently been disentangled from each other. The sleeping-waking cycle is still bound up with the dying and reviving cycle, as we'll see. The nourishment and breathing, two separate faculties, are still not yet differentiated from each other. And it's made up of three different kingdoms of mineral plants. They're all sort of hybrids that have not yet been fully differentiated from each other. Mineral plants, as we'll see, and then we'll see that there are also these sort of animal humans, and then in between them are these plant animals. So everything is sort of half-half. Things are differentiating. They're getting there, but not there fully yet. So what happens then is that the spirits of motion, and we saw going down the hierarchies that with Saturn, the spirits of will had sacrificed their their willing substance to create the physical body. And we saw that the next one down on the Sun phase, the spirits of wisdom had sacrificed their substance to create the etheric body. So now the next hierarchy down of these beings, the spirits of motion, sacrifice some of their substance to create an astral body, which they now imprint onto the human, which creates a sense of pleasure and displeasure. In other words, in Buddhism, that's fear and desire. You're either drawn toward something or you're repelled away from it. Those are the basic motions of life, of being there-ness, let's say. And then the spirits of form, the next hierarchy down, imprint desire, actual longing, and more passions. And so the astral body starts to get more and more complex. But now something happens in which a new element comes in, water, as he calls it. But he doesn't mean today's water, he means liquid. So as we saw with Saturn, we had warmth as a substance that densified on the Sun phase. The warmth densified into air. And then the air densifies now on this phase into water and liquid. And it's just too dense for the higher beings to work with. So it has to separate out into a separate planetary body, which Steiner calls moon. Elsewhere he calls it old moon, which now separates out and takes with it certain higher beings, such as the spirits of form, who go along with it, and three different types of humans. Those humans who had remained spiritually immature on Saturn and remained with only a physical body go along with it, and then another hierarchy up of humans who remain spiritually immature, stuck in the Sun phase, and then there are the mature humans now who are ready to receive the astral body. So we have these three different types of humans, plus some higher beings, such as the spirits of form, and later we'll see the spirits of personality and the spirits of fire play a very significant role in working with the human here. So these beings separate out to work with this the density now of this liquid element, whereas the higher beings with another sun that has separated out remain behind to work with warmth and air. So now that there's also a revolt, and for the first time, Steiner doesn't mention in this subsection, but later in the book he'll make a reference to the cause of the revolt are these Luciferic spirits who want independence. And they revolt against the sun beings. And later on in Steiner's cosmology, he'll have these two different types of spirits, Luciferic spirits on the one hand and Ahrimanic spirits on the other. The Christ being is the being, as we'll see, who mediates precisely between them, as the human should do. Luciferic spirits tempt the human being to believe that spirit is the only thing that's real, whereas Ahrimanic beings are materialists. Atheists, basically. They want you to believe that only matter is real. So they go to both extremes, whereas the reality is that there should be a balance between the two of them. So this is the first appearance that we see of the Luciferic spirits who revolt now. So we have basically the two types of beings on the moon, those who are still working with the sun and those who are independent of it and want nothing to do with it. So now the actual surface of the moon, we have three different kingdoms. Just as we saw with the human world, we have three different types of humans plus higher beings. We have three different kingdoms now. The Earth, the moon rather, is covered with this very viscous elements that's basically semi-living. It's half alive. He calls it a mineral plant substance that's very viscous, that plant animals then grow up out of. They have more mobility and freedom than today's plants do, but nonetheless they're sort of hybrid. They're half plant, half animal. And then the humans themselves that sort of float and swim through this viscous substance. They don't walk on it like we walk on minerals. There is no mineralogical element here. The closest you get is the densification of this viscous liquid. Humans sort of swim and float through this. And what will happen when nourishment happens is that they will eat the plant animals and begin taking in nourishment. So we have these three kingdoms involved here that make up this moon, the body of the moon. At the same time, not only have these beings withdrawn from the sun, and sun beings, the higher sun beings, such as, let's say, the spirits of wisdom, can still work on the humans and the astral body. They don't have to be on the moon to do that. They can radiate these influences from the sun. But now a whole solar system begins to form of beings who begin to withdraw from the sun. And as they withdraw, each one forms the basis of what will later become one of our planets. So Steiner doesn't go into any detail whatsoever about these other celestial bodies. He just remarks now a whole basic astral, let's say, plane version of the solar system now comes into being. And we begin to get this very important part of this process here, which is that the origins of the sleep-wake cycle take place now, and it is insufficiently differentiated. It's not differentiated at all from the dying and reviving cycle. And this is the key thing to understand, I think, about moon, is what happens here. Now, our moon, we only ever see one face of it. We don't ever see the dark side. This version of the moon is revolving and turning. And when it turns toward the sun, what happens is that the astral body plus part of the etheric body leaves the physical body behind, which then disintegrates. The physical body disintegrates. Then the human consciousness is oriented toward the sun, opens to it, and becomes cosmic, and correspondingly duller and dimmer, actually. It becomes a very dim type of consciousness that Steiner says is analogous to a kind of dreamless sleep consciousness. Human beings facing the sun have no independence, but this is a great time when the sun spirits work down on the human being and help it to evolve. And eventually what happens is that it will rebuild a new physical body under the influence of these sun spirits, so that when the astral and part of the etheric returns to this physical body that has also, like the other half of the etheric, and returns to it as it faces away from the sun toward its cosmic night period. During this night period now, individuals feel much more independent, and they have a kind of pictorial consciousness now that's analogous to our dreaming consciousness, except that it's clearer, way clearer than it is when they're facing the sun. So note that it's the exact opposite to what we experience today with our sleep-wake cycle, where when we go to sleep and our astral bodies separate out with our I, with our ego, not the etheric body or where you die. The astral body separates out with the ego and goes into a dream world that's much less clear than when we're back in our physical bodies and we're awake and we have a daylight consciousness that is way clear, super clear. So it's the exact opposite here. When these beings face the sun, their consciousness is dull because it's cosmic. It's too large, I think, for it to become narrowly focused. When they're back in their physical bodies, as they face away from the sun, and they have this sort of nighttime period, the body that they're in gradually hardens and desiccates and becomes unworkable. As the moon then turns toward the sun, then that body disintegrates and then they're out of it. So you can see how the sleep-wake cycle has its origins here, and it is not differentiated from the dying and reviving cycle, as all of these things are still not differentiated. The spirits of fire then come in, and they are working on the moon with the human being. They work on the human etheric body to create the basis of nourishment, whereby, as I mentioned earlier, these animal humans, and Steiner elsewhere says that these animal humans have sort of like human bodies, but they have heads that are that remind you of animal heads, almost like Egyptian gods, I suppose. And they are able to take in the plant animals and metabolize them, but he says that nourishment and respiration are still kind of the same thing. They are insufficiently differentiated in the sense that they're also taking in warmth. This is the basis for respiration. They're taking in warmth. They're letting it stream through them, and it exhales at the same time that they're taking in these plant animal beings and metabolizing them. So those two have yet to be disentangled from each other. And then, let's see, looking through my notes here. You can't do Steiner without notes. As I was saying, it's so complex. So we go down the hierarchies to the sons of life, which is his name for the angels, who are all the way at the bottom of the hierarchy. And we have seen how the angels have evolved in their consciousness, just as humans have evolved. They started at Saturn with a mineralogical type consciousness, and with Sun they moved up to a dreamless sleep type consciousness. And now on Moon they have a kind of pictorial dreaming-like consciousness, whereas angels started on Saturn minus the mineralogical. They were already up to the dreamless sleep consciousness, and then during the Sun phase they had moved up to a pictorial dreaming consciousness. Now during this phase they move up to a human consciousness. And this interaction that the sons of life have with human beings creates the basis for a nervous system, which Steiner says that the nervous system is simply the extension into the physical body of the rudiments of the senses. And we've already seen how way back the spirits of fire had created the seeds for the light organs of senses, such as taste and smell and sound. Those senses come first before a nervous system comes in. The angels bring a nervous system now. And in doing this process, this helps the angels move up to a human consciousness, and they can get inside the bodies of humans and kind of sort of use them as puppets. A little bit like that movie, Being John Malkovich. You remember that movie where the guy is a master puppeteer because he can go through an astral portal into a guy's body and inhabit it like a puppet? It's the same thing that the angels are doing, the sons of life, with human beings as they move up to a human consciousness. And this begins to lay the seeds for the rudiments of what Steiner calls the manas, which is the lowest of the three spiritual faculties that human beings have. Recall that human beings have the highest spiritual faculty is the spirit body, and I'm sort of using my head because I draw it as analogous to the chakras. The spirit body is the highest, which is Steiner calls the Atma, and the life spirit is the middle one, which Steiner calls the Buddhi. And then now we have this, and we saw how the seed for the spirit body emerged during the Saturn phase, and we saw how the seed for the life spirit, the Buddhi, emerged during the sun phase, and now the seed for the manas, the spirit self, emerges through this activity that the angels have with human beings during this period, the manas. Now these terms, Steiner has taken from Sanskrit, of course, but they don't mean the same thing at all. The Atma does not mean what the Atman means in India, which is the soul as this white flash. It's just a flash of pure consciousness made up of Sat Chit Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss. That has nothing to do with what Steiner's talking about by the spirit body, the Atma, or the Buddhi, or the Manas. Manas means mental, intellect, and that's not what he means by the spirit body. So he's taken these terms and re-territorialized them to mean different things. It's good to use them, though, because it gets confusing with these upper three, because different translators will translate them differently. Spirit body is sometimes translated as spirit man. So it gets confusing unless you can anchor them with these three terms and know exactly what he's talking about, the manas or the buddhi or the atma. Anyhow, so the manas then comes into being through the interaction with the angels, or at least the nucleus of it, what will later become the full manas. And then what will happen is that two crucial components of the I, the ego, the seed for the intellectual soul and the seed for the sentient soul, will come into being as spirits of wisdom work on the etheric body to produce the rudiments for what will become the intellectual soul, and the spirits of motion then work on the astral body to produce what will become the rudiments of the sentient soul. But both of those are expressed through the manas, actually, at this time. So again, it's a period here where things are coming into being, but they're not fully differentiated from each other. It's a process of bringing things into being, and then later they will become more and more separate, independent. As cosmic evolution proceeds, these faculties and senses and so forth become separated. The plant animals will separate into a kingdom of animals and a kingdom of plants. The animal humans will separate into a kingdom of animals and a kingdom of humans. The plant mineral viscous substance that's alive will separate into the mineralogical realm, which doesn't exist on Moon. Everything is spongy and soft and swamp-like. Steiner says, think of a bog, a swampy bog, and you'll sort of get the idea of what life was like on old Moon, on this Moon consciousness. And then what will happen then is that the Moon then, after the creation of the manas, and the basic architecture is laid out for the human, all the human subtle bodies, the Moon and the Sun reunite. They reunite together into one cosmic entity in which now the spirits of wisdom come and imprint everything with wisdom. This corresponds, this is why Steiner says, when you get to the Earth phase and you go out and you pick a leaf, you look at it under a microscope, it's filled with wisdom, it's organized, it makes sense. Or take a bone, look at it under a microscope, it's got all these complex hexagonal lattices that look like they've been very carefully thought out. They have been thought out by the spirits of wisdom, which corresponds, by the way, to the Vedantic idea of what's called the Vijnanamaya Kosha, the sheath made of wisdom, wherein, and Steiner has borrowed his model from this Vedantic model, where you have the Atman is the jewel in the lotus, let's say, that's at the center of these concentric sheaths, where it's surrounded by the Annamaya Kosha, which is the physical body, the sheath made of food, the physical body, and then that's connected with a Pranamaya Kosha, which corresponds to Steiner's etheric body, all the etheric forces, the meridians that acupuncture uses to treat you and so forth. And then the Manamaya Kosha, which is the intellect. And the intellect is bound up with these other two. When terrible things happen to the physical body, the intellect says, all life is sorrowful, and seeks for escape through, let's say, nirvana or moksha, whatever the means, whatever the line of flight, as Deleuze and Guattari would call it, would be. Then there's a sort of gap, and then we get the Vijnanamaya Kosha, the sheath made of wisdom. That's what makes the grass come up. Every time you mow the lawn, the grass still comes up. It doesn't just say, forget it, why bother? It still comes up. The trees know what they're doing. Animals know how to reproduce instinctively, and everything knows what it's doing way, way, way before the human intellect comes on very late on the scene and starts to analyze everything. So this is what the spirits of wisdom have done, is imprint everything with wisdom. Now I want to make a couple of final points here about this. One is that the intellectual soul, the rudiments of it, now come into being before the human brain has even been close to being invented. There is no neocortex here yet. The neocortex will eventually be invented through the processes of animal evolution. And it is not the case, as materialists think, that the frontal lobe invents analytical consciousness. That's not the case. Analytical consciousness has already existed on the other side forever, ever since this Steinerian epoch that he's talking about here. The neocortex is invented to channel a pre-existing intellectual consciousness. A perfect analogy would be with electricity. We make machines that channel electricity. Electricity is already there and has always been there before we have made the machines to conduct it. The machines that we make to conduct electricity do not make electricity. Electricity pre-exists them. This is how this process has worked. All the human aspects and faculties, all the senses and tastes, smells and sounds, and the ability to think and speak, all that has already evolved on the other side, long before the physical organs to transmit or channel or conduct, let's say, those energies down here on the physical plane have happened. That's the way this works. The human intellectual soul was there long before the neocortex came along as the latecomer in evolution. That's one of the points I wanted to make. Just a couple of curious points here is that there's a couple of things that puzzle me about Steiner that he didn't get, that surprises me. One is astrology. Steiner didn't get astrology. Didn't want anything to do with it, which is surprising given his interest in all these planets and cosmic bodies, because he regarded the problem of the precession of the equinoxes as rendering Western astrology too problematic to deal with. Everything is back behind 23.5 degrees where it's supposed to be. So he didn't bother with it, so he didn't understand it, so we don't get astrology. So he didn't understand astrology, number one. And point number two, he didn't understand dreams, which is a surprise. You'll see him mentioning dreams, and every time he mentions dreams, he says they're either just meaningless images or the ticking of the clock on your bedside will cause an image maybe of a freight train in one of your dreams going along as it goes along the tracks, or some sort of external stimulus will cause dream images. Otherwise, he says dreams are just these meaningless images. This is why I think Steiner and Jung have to be read together. They supplement each other the same way that Arnold Toynbee and Oswald Spengler should be read together to supplement each other, because they make up for each other's lacks. Steiner didn't get dreams, had no idea what they meant, no idea that there's an individuation process. The dreams actually tell a story, and they're trying to work things out in the unconscious. Steiner doesn't have the concept of the unconscious. It doesn't exist for him. He read Jung and Freud early on. He has a book about them where he's going through dismissing them for this, dismissing them for that. Steiner didn't get Jung. Jung didn't get Steiner. I remember somebody writing him a letter asking him about Rudolf Steiner, and he wrote back, I have not the slightest use for Rudolf Steiner. These guys hated each other. But they're Germans. They're territorial, high intellect Germans. You're not going to get Heidegger in the same room with Oswald Spengler and get the two of them to agree on anything, let's say. Much less, Gene Gebser created his whole masterpiece, The Ever-Present Origin, specifically to rebel against Jung. He was out there teaching at the Jung Institute in Basel. He was one of the great students there, and he specifically wrote that book with its structures of consciousness to get rid of what he thought was a simplistic dualism of conscious versus unconscious, which he thought was way too simplistic. And he rebelled just as the Luciferic spirits have rebelled here. So there's always a secession. of a disaffected internal proletariat in any social formation that takes place, which is why you can't ever allow yourself to get stuck with one thinker. And people who do this, who get stuck in Jung, and they think Jung has all the answers to everything, so they never bother reading anyone else, are only getting one small piece of the truth. Or people who become anthroposophists, Steinerians, and they think Steiner has all the answers, and they don't realize Steiner knows nothing about sex, never mentions sex, nothing about astrology, nothing about dreams. So you have to read these guys critically. These guys are my favorites. I love them. I'm not bashing or anything like that. I'm just saying read critically. When you read these guys, always question everything, because no one gets everything right. Not even somebody that was as titanic a genius as Rudolf Steiner. So we've gone through the first 4 phases, the Saturn phase, the Sun phase, the Moon phase, or 3 phases rather, but now we're going to get to the Earth phase next. And with the Earth phase, things get quite a bit more complicated, as you will guess, because the Earth phase has 7 great epochs. Everything comes out neatly to 7, which in reality I highly doubt is the case. The universe doesn't work that neatly. The universe is full of asymmetries and chaos from chaos theory. It just doesn't go that way. But it's a way to organize the information, so it's fine. And the Earth will have 7 epochs, and then once I think they're what are they? Polarian, Hyperborean, Lemurian, Atlantean, and then ours is the 5th that we're in now. And the 5th epoch that we are in now also has 7 epochs, historical epochs: the Hindu epoch, the Egyptian, and the Persian, as it goes down, and then the Christ event, and then it'll go up to our epoch, and then I think the 6th will belong to the Russians, and the 7th will belong to what he says is the Americans, whatever that future Americans with all their sunken cities will be. So we'll go through all that next. So the model will get even more complex as we go through the Earth phase. So that's where we're at so far. We're halfway through Outline of Esoteric Science.